Commander William Anderson had 116 men, one reactor, and a needle that no longer knew which way north was. Above the hull, the ice was pressing down. Below the keel, the seabed was rising up. There was no window, no periscope depth to run to, and no surface. If the ice closed the gap, there was nowhere to go, and the Arctic Ocean does not return what it takes. It was August 1, 1958. The Nautilus had just dived beneath the polar ice pack in the Barrow Sea Valley, north of Alaska, and the moment she did, every ordinary instrument a mariner had relied on for 400 years began to fail. The magnetic compass had already gone useless. This far north, the magnetic pole was no longer ahead of the ship. It was off to the side and below, and the needle swung and wandered like it was drunk. The gyrocompass was next. A standard gyrocompass finds north by sensing the horizontal spin of the Earth, and the closer you get to the top of the world, the less horizontal spin there is to sense. At the pole itself, there is none at all. The instrument does not lie, it simply has nothing left to tell you. Anderson had been here before, twice. Both times he turned around. Behind him, 10 months earlier, a metal sphere the size of a beach ball had gone into orbit and taken the confidence of the United States with it. Before we go further, I want to ask you for something small. Cold War Impact is an independent history channel, and lately the numbers have not been kind. If you value history that checks its sources instead of repeating myths, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with someone who would enjoy it. Every one of those actions helps this channel reach people it would never otherwise reach. Now let us go back to the ice. For 10 months, the United States had been losing a contest it did not fully understand. It had lost it in the sky, where a Soviet satellite passed over American cities beeping. It had lost it on the launch pad at Cape Canaveral, in front of the world's press, in a fireball that lasted 2 seconds. It had lost it in the private calculations of men who had spent their careers believing American engineering was simply better than anyone else's, and who now had to consider that it might not be. By the summer of 1958, the country was pouring money into rockets, into schools, into a new civilian space agency, into an alphabet of crash programs. Almost none of it would produce a visible result for years. And the whole time, the thing that would let the United States stand up and say we are not finished had already been built. It had been in the water since January 1955. It was not a secret. It was not a prototype. It was a commissioned warship, with a crew and a hull number and a berth in Groton, Connecticut. And in the panic that followed Sputnik, almost nobody in Washington thought to look at it. To understand how a submarine ended up carrying the prestige of a superpower, you have to go back to a Friday night in October, and to a beeping sound that anybody with a shortwave radio could hear for themselves. On October 4, 1957, at 7:28 in the evening Greenwich time, a rocket lifted off from a launch site in the Kazakh steppe. The Soviets called the place Scientific Research Test Range No. 5. The world would later learn to call it Baikonur. The rocket was a modified R-7 Semyorka, and its payload was a polished sphere of aluminum alloy, 58 centimeters across, weighing 83.6 kilograms. 4 whip antennas trailed behind it. Inside were batteries, a thermometer, a pressure sensor, and 2 radio transmitters. It was, by any technical measure, a simple object. It carried no camera. It performed no experiment of consequence. Its entire purpose was to go around the Earth and make a noise. It made that noise on 20.005 and 40.002 megahertz, and that was the detail that did the damage. Those were frequencies amateur radio operators could receive. This was not a claim in a Soviet newspaper that had to be taken on trust. Any teenager in Ohio, with the right equipment, could tune in and hear the Soviet Union pass overhead. The beep was not evidence of the achievement. The beep was the achievement, delivered directly into American living rooms, roughly every 96 minutes. The orbit ran from a low point of around 215 kilometers to a high point of around 939 kilometers, which meant it crossed over most of the inhabited world. It transmitted for about 3 weeks, until its silver zinc batteries went flat, and burned up in the atmosphere in the first days of January 1958. The satellite itself was harmless. Everyone understood that. The problem was never the satellite. The problem was that to put 83 kilograms into orbit, you have to throw something considerably heavier, a very long way, in a very flat arc. The rocket that lifted Sputnik was not a research vehicle. It was a derivative of an intercontinental ballistic missile. The Soviet Union had announced in August 1957 that it had tested one. The Western press had shrugged. An announcement is just words, and words can be a bluff. And then, 6 weeks later, the bluff started beeping over Kansas. The American reaction was not measured, and it is worth being precise about what people actually said, because this is where history gets embellished. Edward Teller, the physicist, went on television and told the country the United States had lost a battle more important and greater than Pearl Harbor. That quotation is real. Historians have since pointed out that Teller almost certainly knew it was an exaggeration, and said it anyway, because he wanted the money to flow. Senator Lyndon Johnson was at his ranch in Texas. He would later describe walking out under the sky that night and finding that somehow, in some new way, the sky seemed almost alien. He said he remembered the profound shock of realizing that it might be possible for another nation to achieve technological superiority over this great country of ours. His aide, George Reedy, put it more bluntly in a memo. It did not matter, Reedy wrote, whether the satellite had any military value. The important thing was that the Russians had left the Earth. President Eisenhower did not panic, and this is one of the most misunderstood parts of the entire episode. Eisenhower publicly dismissed it. He said the launch did not raise his apprehensions one iota. He described it, in effect, as one small ball in the air. He was mocked for this. He was called complacent, out of touch, an old general asleep at the wheel while the future went over his head. Eisenhower was right, and he could not explain why he was right, because the reason was classified. He was already receiving photographic intelligence. The U-2 reconnaissance aircraft had been flying over Soviet territory since 1956. He knew what the Soviets actually possessed, which was a very small number of enormous, temperamental rockets, not a fleet ready to fly. He could not say so without revealing that American aircraft were violating Soviet airspace. So he absorbed the abuse and said nothing. The country did not listen to him anyway. In November, a presidential committee chaired by a lawyer named Rowan Gaither delivered a top-secret report warning that the Soviet Union could have a serious intercontinental missile capability by the end of 1959, that American bomber bases were vulnerable to a surprise attack, and that the nation needed fallout shelters and a very large increase in defense spending. The report was classified. It leaked almost immediately. It poured petrol on a fire that was already burning. And on November 3, 1 month after the first satellite, the Soviets launched again. Sputnik 2 weighed around 508 kilograms. That is more than 6 times the mass of Sputnik 1. To American analysts, that number was more frightening than anything in the Gaither report, because throw weight is the entire game. If you can put 500 kilograms in orbit, you can deliver a warhead. Sputnik 2 carried a passenger, a stray dog from the streets of Moscow, a small mongrel that the world came to know as Laika. The Soviet Union said for decades that she lived several days in orbit and was painlessly put to sleep. That was a lie, and we have known it since October 2002, when a Soviet scientist named Dmitry Malyshenkov presented a paper in Houston and told the truth. The booster stage failed to separate properly. The thermal control system did not work. The cabin temperature climbed past 40 degrees Celsius. Laika died of overheating and stress within about 5 to 7 hours of launch. There had never been a plan to bring her back. One of the scientists involved, Oleg Gazenko, said publicly in 1998 that he regretted it and that they had not learned enough to justify the death of the dog. That is the truth of it, and it belongs in the record. Now, if the Soviets had a rocket that could reach America, the United States needed one too, and it needed it visibly, and it needed it fast. The answer was supposed to be a program called Vanguard, run by the Naval Research Laboratory, a civilian scientific effort intended to launch a small satellite for the International Geophysical Year. On December 6, 1957, at Cape Canaveral, with the American press invited to watch, Vanguard Test Vehicle 3 ignited its engines. It rose about 4 feet. 2 seconds after liftoff, it lost thrust, settled back onto the pad, and exploded. And out of the fire, thrown clear across the sand, tumbled the little grapefruit-sized satellite it had been carrying. It came to rest in the wreckage and began transmitting its signal. It sat there in the scrub at Cape Canaveral, beeping, announcing to anyone listening that it was ready to go into orbit, from the ground, where it would remain. The newspapers had a wonderful time. Flopnik, Kaputnik, Stayputnik. The damaged satellite was recovered, and it is in the collection of the Smithsonian to this day, a small dented sphere that is one of the most eloquent objects in the history of the Cold War. 6 weeks later, on January 31, 1958, the United States did get a satellite into orbit. Explorer 1 went up on a Juno 1 rocket, a modified Jupiter C, built by Wernher von Braun's team at the Army Ballistic Missile Agency. It carried an instrument designed by James Van Allen, and it discovered the radiation belts that now bear his name. It was a genuine scientific achievement, more scientifically valuable than Sputnik had been. Nobody cared. Sputnik was first. Explorer 1 was fourth, after 2 Sputniks, and after the humiliation on the pad. In the arithmetic of prestige, being right does not count. Being first does. And here we should be careful, because the standard telling of this story says that America panicked, and that is not quite what happened. The press panicked. The New York Times mentioned the satellite in 279 articles in 26 days, more than 11 a day, about a metal ball. Congress panicked. Lyndon Johnson opened hearings in late November and turned the Senate into a stage for the crisis. The scientific establishment panicked, and it had a great deal to gain from a frightened Congress with a checkbook. But when the political analyst Samuel Lubell went out and actually surveyed ordinary Americans about how they felt, he found, in his words, no evidence at all of any panic or hysteria in the public's reaction. This was not a nation of terrified citizens, it was an elite panic. It was a panic among the people who wrote the newspapers, ran the committees, and applied for the grants. That distinction matters because it explains what happened next, which was one of the largest peacetime expansions of the American federal government in the 20th century, executed in under a year. In November 1957, Eisenhower appointed James Killian, the president of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, as the first true presidential science advisor, and stood up a White House Science Advisory Committee to go with him. In February 1958, the Department of Defense created the Advanced Research Projects Agency, a small organization designed to fund research too strange and too speculative for the individual armed services to touch. You know it today as DARPA. Its founding was an explicit response to Sputnik, to what its own official history calls technological surprise. In July 1958, Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act, and on October 1, almost exactly 1 year after Sputnik, NASA opened for business, built on the bones of the old Aeronautics Research Committee that had existed since 1915. Eisenhower insisted it be civilian because the military services had spent years fighting each other over the satellite program and had produced the fiasco on the pad. And in September 1958, he signed the National Defense Education Act, which put more than $1 billion into American schools and universities over the following years. It created federal student loans, it funded fellowships and laboratories and the teaching of mathematics, of science, and of foreign languages. A generation of American scientists went to college on that money. Look closely at the name of that act. It is not the Education Act. It is the National Defense Education Act, and that was not an accident. Federal money for schools had been proposed before and had died because a block of legislators regarded it as an intrusion into a matter belonging to the states. Attach the word defense, and it passed. The bill that could not pass as education passed as a weapon. That is the real legacy of Sputnik in America. Not fear, institutions. NASA, DARPA, and the modern federal role in funding American science all trace directly back to a beeping sphere the size of a beach ball. Eisenhower watched all of it and was not entirely pleased. He described the reaction as a wave of near hysteria. He watched the Air Force and its contractors inflate their estimates of Soviet strength to extract money from a frightened Congress, and he could not contradict them without revealing what his spy planes had seen. He spent 3 years being called complacent by people who were, in his private judgment, either mistaken or on the make. 3 years later, in January 1961, on his last night in office, he went on television and warned the American people about the unwarranted influence of what he called the military-industrial complex. Historians have argued ever since about what he meant, but he had spent the preceding years watching a false alarm turn into a permanent appetite, and there is no serious doubt that the experience shaped the warning. So the Americans had lost the sky, and the man who took it from them did not have a name. In the Soviet Union, the person responsible for Sputnik was referred to in the press, when he was referred to at all, as the chief designer, not a name, a job title. Cosmonauts who flew on his rockets sometimes did not know what to call him. He was the most consequential engineer alive, and officially he did not exist. His name was Sergei Pavlovich Korolev, and the Soviet state had very nearly killed him. Korolev was born in 1907. He was a gifted engineer, a glider pilot, a founding figure in Soviet rocketry, and in June 1938, during the Great Purge, he was arrested on fabricated charges. He was interrogated, his jaw was broken, he was sent east to the gold mines of Kolyma, one of the deadliest destinations in the Gulag system. Men did not generally come back from Kolyma. He lost his teeth to scurvy. He nearly died. He was pulled out, eventually, and put to work in a sharashka, a prison design bureau, where imprisoned engineers worked on aircraft under guard, because the state had realized it needed the men it was in the process of destroying. He spent the war as a prisoner engineer. He was not formally rehabilitated until 1957, the same year his rocket put the first object into orbit. Think about what that means. The man who launched Sputnik, and who would go on to launch the first human being into space, had been beaten and imprisoned by the same government he made look invincible. He could not be named, partly for security, partly because the Soviet Union did not want the world asking who this man was or where he had been. He worked in anonymity for the rest of his life. His rocket, the R-7, was a genuine engineering triumph. 34 meters tall, 280 tons, burning kerosene and liquid oxygen, with a cluster of engines firing at once because no single engine of the required size existed. Its first fully successful flight was in August 1957. On paper, it could carry a 3-megaton warhead, something like 8,000 kilometers. On paper, it could reach the United States. And here is the part that almost never gets told, and it is the single most important fact in the first half of this story. The R-7 was, as a weapon, close to useless. It burned cryogenic propellant. Liquid oxygen must be kept extraordinarily cold and boils off constantly, which means a fueled R-7 cannot sit and wait. It could not be held on alert. Preparing one took roughly 20 hours. It required an enormous fixed launch complex that could not be hidden or moved. The Soviet Union never built more than a handful of operational pads for it, and withdrew it from military service in the 1960s. In other words, the missile that terrified the United States could not have been used in a surprise attack. 20 hours of visible preparation at a fixed site is not a first strike. It is an announcement. Nikita Khrushchev knew this perfectly well, and he did something brilliant with it. He lied. He told the world that the Soviet Union was turning out missiles like sausages. His own son later recounted that his father understood the truth clearly, that the actual number of missiles was not what mattered, and that what mattered was that the Americans believed in Soviet power. They did believe. The phrase missile gap entered American politics, and it was used relentlessly in the 1960 election campaign by a young senator named John Kennedy, who accused the Eisenhower administration of letting the country fall behind. Then the photographs came back. In August 1960, an American reconnaissance satellite ejected a capsule of exposed film, which was caught in mid-air over the Pacific by an aircraft trailing a hook. It was the first time film had ever been recovered from orbit, and that single mission returned more photographic coverage of the Soviet Union than every spy plane flight that had come before it, combined. The pictures showed the truth. 6 months earlier, American intelligence had estimated the Soviets would have between 140 and 200 intercontinental missiles by 1961. After the film came back, that estimate was cut to somewhere between 10 and 25. The real figure was smaller still. When Kennedy took office, he was told privately that the gap was a fiction. In February 1961, his own Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, told reporters there was no missile gap. It was politically excruciating, because the new administration had won an election partly by campaigning on it. The gap was real. It simply ran the other way. Declassified figures indicate that around 1960, the Soviet Union had roughly 10 intercontinental ballistic missiles. The United States had around 57. The Panic of 1957 was built on a rocket that could not do the job, fielded by a nation that had almost none of them, designed by a man whose own government had sent him to a death camp. But nobody in America knew that in 1957. What they knew was the beeping. And what the government needed, urgently, was something big, something visible, something that would put an American achievement on the front page of every newspaper on Earth and prove that the United States could still do what nobody else could. They found it. It had been sitting in Groton, Connecticut, the entire time. The USS Nautilus was not built to answer Sputnik. It was built because one man refused to take no for an answer for the better part of a decade. Hyman Rickover was not a popular officer. He was abrasive, contemptuous of ceremony, openly rude to admirals, and he did not care in the slightest. He was the son of a Polish-Jewish immigrant tailor. He had come up through the Naval Academy at a time when that background made him an outsider, and he had concluded early that the way to get things done in a large institution was to ignore the institution wherever possible. He kept no book of Navy regulations in his office. He said so, proudly. Rickover had grasped something many of his superiors had not. A conventional submarine of the 1940s was not really a submarine. It was a surface ship that could hide underwater for a few hours. It ran on diesel engines, which need air, so it had to surface, or at least put a snorkel out, to breathe and recharge. Underwater, on batteries alone, it was slow, and it was on a clock. A nuclear reactor does not breathe. A submarine built around one is not a surface ship that can dive. It is a genuine underwater vessel that can stay down for as long as the crew has food and the machinery keeps making oxygen. It changes what a submarine fundamentally is. Getting the Navy to build one took a fight that nearly ended his career. In 1949, Rickover pulled off an administrative trick that deserves to be better known. He got himself appointed to run the nuclear power branch of the Navy's Bureau of Ships. Then he also got himself appointed to run the Naval Reactors branch of the Atomic Energy Commission, a civilian body. He now held 2 jobs in 2 different arms of the government, and those 2 arms had to write to each other. Which meant that Hyman Rickover could write a letter to Hyman Rickover, requesting something from Hyman Rickover, and Hyman Rickover could approve it. He had built himself a chain of command with exactly 1 link in it. Superiors who wanted to slow him down discovered they were not actually in the loop. You do not do that and remain popular. Rickover was passed over for promotion to Rear Admiral twice, and under the rules of the time, being passed over twice meant mandatory retirement. The nuclear navy would have lost its architect before it had a single boat in the water. He was reportedly working, by this point, out of a converted ladies' room. What saved him was Congress and the press. A Senate committee, having watched what was happening, simply refused to confirm the promotions of 39 other captains, until Rickover's name was on the list. A journalist named Clay Blair, a former submariner, wrote a book about him that made the story public and embarrassing. A special selection board was convened. In 1953, Rickover got his star, and he would go on to serve 63 years, the longest-serving naval officer in the history of the United States. He then set about making himself feared. He personally interviewed every single officer who wanted to serve in the nuclear program for 30 years, and those interviews became notorious. He kept a chair in his office with several inches sawn off the front legs, so that the man sitting in it slid slowly forward and could never quite get comfortable. He would ask questions designed to provoke. He sent candidates to sit in a closet to think about their answers. He was, by any reasonable standard, an extremely difficult human being to work for. He was also right. Across more than 7,600 reactor years of operation, the United States Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program has never had a reactor accident and has never released radioactivity in a way that harmed the public or the environment. 2 American nuclear submarines have been lost, the Thresher and the Scorpion, and in neither case was the reactor the cause. Both plants shut themselves down safely, and decades of monitoring of the wrecks have found no significant release. That record was built by a man who made grown officers sit in a broken chair. In the summer of 1953, at a test site in the Idaho desert, the land-based prototype of the submarine reactor was running. The plan was to test it for around 48 hours. Rickover overruled that. He wanted the reactor run at full power, continuously, for 96 hours, which was the time it would take a submarine to cross the Atlantic underwater. There was a chart on the wall plotting a course from Nova Scotia to Ireland. His engineers objected. It was a machine that had barely been switched on. He told them, in words that have been recorded, that no submarine in the history of the world had ever run continuously more than 20 miles at full power, and that this run would show people the thing was real, that it was not a toy. And the run went wrong. This is the part that usually gets left out. Around 60 hours in, a condenser tube began to leak, and radiation was detected near it. Then the steam generators began to leak. Then a control system failed, and the water level dropped, and the reactor power went erratic. The nuclear core was fine. Everything attached to it was misbehaving. The engineers wanted to shut down. Rickover refused, and took the responsibility onto himself, and the crew fixed the plant while it was running. The prototype crossed its imaginary Atlantic in 96 hours. It was not a clean, effortless triumph. It was a machine held together by men who did not stop, and that is a considerably better story than the one in the textbooks. The keel of the Nautilus was laid on June 14, 1952. She was launched on January 21, 1954, christened by the First Lady, Mamie Eisenhower. She was commissioned on September 30, 1954, and on January 17, 1955, she cast off her lines, moved down the Thames River, and her commanding officer sent a signal that is now carved into the history of the United States Navy, underway on nuclear power. She was 319 feet of steel with a Westinghouse pressurized water reactor in her belly, and she made every other submarine on Earth obsolete. She could do more than 20 knots submerged, faster than most ships could hunt her, and she could do it for weeks. She wrecked the Navy's own anti-submarine exercises because tactics developed to hunt German U-boats did not work against a target that never had to surface and could outrun the escorts. By the autumn of 1957, when the beeping started, the Nautilus had been in commission for 3 years and had already logged more than 60,000 nautical miles. She was not a drawing board proposal. She was tied up at a pier in Connecticut, fully operational. Somebody just had to think of her. Now, the idea of going to the North Pole under the ice was not invented in a White House meeting in 1957. It was not even invented in the 1950s. In 1931, an Australian polar explorer named Sir Hubert Wilkins leased a worn-out American submarine from the First World War, a boat called the O-12, for the sum of $1 a year. He renamed her the Nautilus, after the submarine in the Jules Verne novel, and he announced that he was going to take her to the North Pole under the ice. It was a catastrophe. A crewman drowned before they even left New York. Prohibition was in force, so she was christened with a bucket of ice instead of champagne, with Jules Verne's grandson standing there watching. Both engines failed in the middle of the Atlantic, and she had to be towed. Her diving planes were found to be missing, and Wilkins suspected sabotage by a crew that had no wish to go under the polar ice in that vessel. She reached about 82 degrees north, further than any ship had gone under its own power, and turned back. She was scuttled in a Norwegian fjord at the end of that year. So a submarine named Nautilus had already tried to reach the North Pole, and failed, 27 years before the one in this story. Remember Wilkins. He is going to come back at the end, and he is going to get there. The serious technical work was carried out by a civilian physicist named Waldo Lyon at the Navy Electronics Laboratory in San Diego, who had been quietly obsessed with under-ice submarine operations since the 1940s and who would go on to spend his entire career on it. And in August 1957, before Sputnik, the Nautilus had already gone north to find out what the problem actually was. She sailed from Groton on August 19, 1957. This was not an attempt on the pole. Nobody had authorized one. It was an exploratory probe, sent to learn what a nuclear submarine could and could not do beneath the ice. Anderson's orders took him to roughly 83 degrees north, with the word approximately inserted, which is the sort of word a commander notices. She made 3 separate excursions under the pack. On one of them, coming up into an opening in the ice, she struck a block of it hard enough to bend both periscopes backward and damage the leading edge of the sail. One periscope was repaired at the ice edge by her own crew. The other was a write-off. On the deepest excursion, in early September, she reached 87 degrees north. That is roughly 180 nautical miles from the pole, and it was further north than any ship in history had ever been. And then a fuse blew. This is the mundane, unglamorous heart of the whole problem, and it is why nobody had done it. It was not the ice. It was not the cold. It was that a submarine under a permanent roof of ice cannot navigate. It cannot take a star sight. It cannot see a landmark. It cannot get a radio fix. It has one tool, a compass, and near the top of the world a compass does not work. The magnetic compass fails first, because the magnetic pole is not the geographic pole. It is hundreds of miles away, and as you approach the top of the world, the needle stops pointing usefully forward and starts pointing sideways, or down. The gyrocompass fails second, for a reason that is almost philosophical. It does not sense magnetism at all. It senses the rotation of the Earth, specifically the horizontal component of that rotation, and settles itself to point at true north. But as you move toward the pole, that horizontal component shrinks. At the pole, the Earth's rotation is entirely vertical relative to you. There is no horizontal spin left. The gyrocompass is not broken. It has run out of information. So the Nautilus, in 1957, with the most advanced propulsion system on Earth, was reduced to a single fragile thread. Everything depended on her gyrocompasses. And on the evening of September 4, at 87 degrees north, the power supply to both of them failed. A fuse blew. That was it. That was the whole thing. The most advanced warship ever built, 180 miles from the top of the world, with a reactor that could have run for years, and a blown fuse took away her ability to know which way she was facing. Anderson turned around and came home. The most powerful navy on Earth had been stopped by a component worth a few cents. 1 month later, Sputnik went up. And that changed everything about what a trip to the North Pole was worth. President Eisenhower needed a victory, not a scientific one, a theatrical one. He needed something the world could look at and understand instantly, and something the Soviet Union could not immediately match. A submarine crossing the top of the world beneath the polar ice, from the Pacific to the Atlantic, passing directly under the geographic North Pole, was exactly that. It was spectacular, it was unambiguous, and it required the one technology in which the United States held a commanding lead: nuclear propulsion. The mission was given a name: Operation Sunshine. It was classified. Commander William Anderson had taken command of the Nautilus in June 1957. He was a Tennessee man, a 1942 graduate of the Naval Academy, and he had made 11 war patrols in submarines in the Pacific during the Second World War. He knew exactly how far a submarine could be pushed, because he had been aboard boats that had been pushed that far. The secrecy around Sunshine was extraordinary. The crew were not told where they were going, cover stories were issued, and Anderson traveled to Washington out of uniform to avoid drawing attention. If the mission failed, the United States could not afford another Vanguard, another public humiliation with the cameras running. So there would be no cameras and no announcement. If they failed, nobody would ever know they had tried. Which was fortunate, because they were about to fail. In June 1958, the Nautilus went north for the second time. She left Seattle on June 9, headed for the Bering Strait, the narrow gate between Alaska and Siberia that leads from the Pacific into the Arctic Ocean. She nearly did not make it out of American waters, because the most advanced warship on the planet was leaking. On the way to the Pacific, the crew had already fought a fire in oil-soaked insulation wrapped around a high-pressure steam turbine. Then a condenser sprang a leak, which on a nuclear submarine is not a small matter, because the condenser is part of the system that turns the reactor's heat into propulsion. So members of her crew were sent ashore in civilian clothes, with instructions not to explain themselves, to visit ordinary gas stations and automotive shops and buy up every bottle they could find of a commercial radiator sealant sold under the name Bar's Leak. They bought something in the region of 140 quarts of it. They poured it into the condenser of the world's first nuclear-powered submarine. It worked. The company would later use the story in its advertising. That is the reality behind the myth of effortless American technological supremacy. The vessel about to carry the prestige of the United States to the top of the world was patched with something you could buy off a shelf, by sailors who were not allowed to say why they wanted it. And then came the geography that nearly killed them, and it had nothing to do with compasses. The Bering Strait is shallow, so is the Chukchi Sea beyond it. In places the water is only a couple of 100 feet deep, and the polar ice pack is not a smooth sheet, like the surface of a frozen pond. It is a chaotic, grinding, shifting mass, and where flows collide they buckle and pile downward, forming ridges of ice that hang far below the waterline. Some of them reach down 100 feet, some reach further. So the submarine is in a corridor. The roof is jagged ice hanging down. The floor is the seabed, and in the shallow water of the Chukchi Sea, that corridor can narrow to almost nothing. On June 19, the Nautilus entered the Chukchi Sea and found exactly that trap. The ice was pressing down into water that was already too shallow. At one point she threaded beneath a wall of ice, hanging down more than 60 feet, with roughly 5 feet of clearance above the hull. The crew in the sonar shack later described hunching their shoulders and leaning, as though body language could make the submarine slimmer. Anderson looked at the ice conditions, looked at the depth under the keel, and made the decision that a good commander has to be able to make. He turned around. On June 28, the Nautilus tied up at Pearl Harbor to wait for the ice to open. She had not been beaten by the Soviet Union. She had not been beaten by a weapon. She had been beaten by the fact that in June, the Chukchi ice had not yet retreated far enough for a submarine to fit underneath it. That is what the second attempt cost. Weeks of preparation, a president's expectation, and not 1 mile of progress toward the pole. But something had changed, and it had arrived on board in a crate. The Nautilus was fitted with an inertial navigation system, a naval version of a device built by North American Aviation for the Navajo supersonic cruise missile, a program that had been cancelled. The Navajo was dead. Its guidance system was not. An inertial navigator does not care about the Earth's magnetic field, and it does not care about the Earth's rotation, and it therefore does not care that both become useless at the top of the world. What it does is stranger and simpler. It contains gyroscopes and accelerometers, and it measures every acceleration the vehicle undergoes, in every direction, continuously. Tell it precisely where it is when it starts, and it will track every push and turn and change of speed, add all of it up, and tell you where you are now. It does not need to sense anything outside the hull. It knows where you are because it has been paying attention to every movement you have made since you left. Alongside it went a Sperry gyrocompass, capable of operating in a mode that did not fail at extreme latitude, and upward-looking sonar, fathometers pointed at the ceiling instead of the floor, so the crew could measure the ice above them and find the thin places and the open patches of water, the polinias, where a submarine might come up. That is the whole answer. That is the machine that solves the problem, not the reactor. The reactor got them there and kept them alive. But what let them find the pole was a guidance system built for a cancelled missile, bolted into a submarine, doing dead reckoning at a level of precision no human navigator could match. And now we can state the equation of the entire mission plainly. The Nautilus could stay submerged indefinitely because her reactor did not breathe. She could find her way beneath a roof of ice with no sky and no landmarks because of the inertial navigator, and she could see the ice above her and measure it and find the gaps because of the upward sonar. Those three things together meant the crossing was possible, and in 1958 they meant it was possible only for her. It is worth being exact about why, because the real reason is more interesting than the one people assume. It was not that the Soviet Union had no nuclear submarine. It did. The K-3 had been launched in 1957, and her reactors were started up in July 1958, the very month the Nautilus sailed from Pearl Harbor. But she was a trials boat with an unproven power plant, and she could not have found the pole. Soviet submarine navigation in 1958 was reliable only to about 80 degrees north. The Soviet Union had no inertial navigation system at all, and would not have one until the early 1970s. The polar gyro instrument that eventually allowed a Soviet boat to make the transit was not even proposed until October 1958, 2 months after the Nautilus had already done it, and was not tested at sea until 1961. The head of Soviet shipbuilding put the problem in a sentence that deserves to be remembered. With the navigation equipment they had, he said, they knew how to get to the North Pole. They did not know how to get back from it. So the barrier was never the reactor. It was the ability to know where you were. The margin, however, was absolute. If the reactor failed under the ice, there was no surfacing. If the navigator drifted, they would be lost beneath 1 million square miles of ice, with no way to fix their position. If they misjudged a ridge in shallow water, they would strike it at speed with the seabed underneath them. There is no rescue in the Arctic Ocean. Nobody was coming. On July 23, 1958, the Nautilus left Pearl Harbor and went north for the third time. The ice had retreated. The route this time ran up through the Bering Strait, but through the deeper western channel, the Siberian side, and then across the Chukchi Sea to the Barrow Sea Valley, a trench in the seabed north of Alaska that offered the one thing the previous attempt had lacked: depth. A deep water door underneath the ice. On August 1, the Nautilus dived and went under. From that moment there was no going up. The roof closed over them. 116 men in a steel tube under a permanent ceiling of ice, running north on the word of a machine. They ran deep and fast, because Anderson had concluded that speed was safety. The longer they were under the ice, the more chances the ice had to kill them. The inertial navigator held. The upward sonar traced the ceiling above them, a jagged, inverted landscape of ice keels and pressure ridges scrolling past overhead, hour after hour, and the crew watched it the way you would watch a mountain range from below. They crossed 85 degrees north, then 86. The point where the first attempt had failed came and went beneath them, and this time nothing quit. Then 88, then 89. Anderson came on the intercom to count the crew down through the final miles, so that every man aboard, the cooks and the reactor operators, and the sonarmen and the torpedomen, would know the exact instant it happened. The whole ship counted. At 11:15 in the evening, Eastern Daylight Time, on August 3, 1958, the USS Nautilus passed beneath the geographic North Pole, 90 degrees north, the point where every direction is south. She crossed at about 400 feet, doing 20 knots. Above her, the ice. Below her keel, the water went down more than 13,000 feet to a seabed no human being had ever seen. Anderson spoke to his crew. For the world, our country, and the Navy, the North Pole, there was nothing to see. There was no monument, no marker, no moment of light. There was only a number on an instrument dial and several hundred feet of black water, and above that, the ice. And then something happened that no planner in Washington had scripted, because sailors are sailors. There was a party. Not in the control room, where the navigator, Lieutenant Shepard Jenks, was still working, but in the crew's mess. Anderson signed commemorative letters, one to President Eisenhower and one to Mamie Eisenhower, who had christened the boat 4 years earlier. Postcards were handed around and stamped. An electrician's mate named James Sordelit re-enlisted in the United States Navy, becoming the first man in history to sign on for another tour at the North Pole. And an engineman named William McNally put on a Santa Claus outfit, which he had somehow smuggled aboard a top-secret polar mission and told his commanding officer off for trespassing. Under the ice cap, at the top of the world, in a steel tube full of nuclear machinery, the crew of the Nautilus threw a party with a fake Santa Claus. Jenks kept his handwritten position report from that night for the rest of his life. It is in the museum at Groton now. They did not stop. They kept going, out the other side of the world, down toward the Greenland Sea, and after 96 hours beneath the ice, and roughly 1,590 nautical miles of it, the Nautilus came up in open water northeast of Greenland. Anderson sent a signal, 4 words long, and it went to the President of the United States. Nautilus, 90 north. The White House released the news, and the effect was immediate and total. The Nautilus had done something no vessel in human history had done. She had crossed the Arctic Ocean beneath the ice, from the Pacific to the Atlantic, passing directly under the top of the world. Anderson was flown to Washington and decorated with the Legion of Merit by Eisenhower personally. The Nautilus received a Presidential Unit Citation, the first ever awarded in peacetime. There was no war. The Navy had just been handed the country's highest form of unit recognition for a voyage. New York gave her a ticker tape parade, in the same city that 10 months earlier had been reading headlines about Sputnik. And that was the point. That was the entire point. Now here is where an honest history has to slow down and say something a triumphant one would not. Militarily, the transit of the North Pole by the Nautilus accomplished very close to nothing. It sank nothing. It threatened nothing. It changed no war plan the following morning. It was a piece of theater, authorized at the highest level of the American government as a response to a propaganda defeat. That is not a criticism of the crew, who took a genuine and lethal risk. It is a description of why they were sent. It also did not last. It was not even the most important thing that happened under the ice that decade. The USS Skate, another nuclear submarine, under Commander James Calvert, reached the pole 8 days behind the Nautilus on August 11, 1958. She tried to surface there and could not. The ice above the pole was too thick and too solid, and Calvert wrote afterward that seldom had the ice seemed as heavy as it did right at the top of the world. So he came back in the winter, which ought to make your blood run slightly cold. In March, the Arctic is at its worst. The ice is thicker, the leads are frozen over, and there is almost no daylight. Most of his crew came back with him. On March 17, 1959, the Skate found a thin patch of ice, a narrow lead that had frozen over, and spent 2 hours easing upward, watching the ice on an underwater television camera, and knowing that if she came up crooked, she would tear off her own conning tower. And then she broke through. The Skate became the first ship in the history of the world to surface at the North Pole. Think about why that is the more significant event, and not simply the second one. A submarine that can pass under the ice is a submarine that can hide. A submarine that can break up through the ice from below is a submarine that can shoot. If a missile-carrying submarine can sit beneath the polar ice, invisible to any aircraft, any satellite, any ship on the surface of the sea, and then punch through the roof and launch, then the ice is no longer an obstacle. It is armor. And there is one more thing that happened on the ice that day, and it is the reason I asked you to remember a man from 1931. Sir Hubert Wilkins, the Australian explorer who had leased a rusting submarine for $1, named her Nautilus, and failed to reach the North Pole beneath the ice, had died in November 1958. Some months before his death, he had visited the Skate at her berth in New London. He had left a request. So on March 17, 1959, in the Arctic night, the crew of the Skate climbed out onto the ice at the top of the world. They lit the scene with red torches. A rifle party fired a salute into the dark, and they scattered the ashes of Sir Hubert Wilkins at 90 degrees north. He had spent his life trying to get there in a submarine. He got there in a submarine. He was 28 years late, and he was dead, and he made it. And the capability the Skate demonstrated is the one that mattered, because it fed into the weapon that actually answered Sputnik. That weapon was Polaris, a ballistic missile small enough and stable enough to be carried inside a submarine and fired from beneath the sea, from a moving boat, from anywhere in the ocean. The USS George Washington was launched in June 1959. On July 20, 1960, she fired a Polaris from underwater, and her commanding officer, James Osborne, sent the president a message that said, "Polaris, from out of the deep to target, perfect." That November she left on the first deterrent patrol and stayed down for 66 days. That is what answered the R-7, not the pole. It did not matter how many missiles the Soviet Union had on the ground if the United States kept submarines in the deep ocean that could not be found, could not be destroyed, and could fire back afterward. A silo can be targeted. A bomber base can be targeted. A submarine 2 months into a patrol, somewhere beneath 1,000,000 square miles of water, cannot. The Soviets reached the pole eventually. On July 17, 1962, the K-3 passed beneath it submerged, the first Soviet submarine to do so, almost 4 years after the Nautilus. The ice was too thick to surface at the pole itself, so they came up through a lead some distance away and planted a flag on a hummock of ice. The American lead in the polar ocean had lasted precisely as long as it took the other side to solve the navigation problem. Now, what happened to the men? There is a version of this story where the hero disappears into silence and is forgotten, and it is a very satisfying version, and it is not true, so we are not going to tell it. William Anderson did not vanish. He co-wrote a best-selling book about the voyage, called Nautilus 90 North, published in 1959. He was famous, and then he did something with that fame that almost nobody expected. He went into politics, and he was elected to Congress as a Democrat from Tennessee, serving from 1965 to 1973. And in 1970, on a visit to South Vietnam, Anderson and another congressman went to the prison on Con Son Island and found the tiger cages, stone pits where prisoners were kept in conditions that shocked him. He came home, and he said so publicly, at considerable political cost, in the middle of a war that his own country was fighting. He became a critic of that war. He lost his seat in the 1972 election. The man who had been decorated by a president for a Cold War propaganda triumph spent the back half of his career telling the American public things it did not want to hear. He died in 2007. Hyman Rickover stayed exactly as difficult as he had always been. He built the nuclear navy. He personally interviewed every officer who wanted to serve in it, and those interviews became legendary for their strangeness and their cruelty. He served for 63 years. He was finally pushed into retirement in 1982, at the age of 82, and he did not go quietly. He had spent his entire life fighting bureaucracies, and the bureaucracy finally got him. He died in 1986. Waldo Lyon, the civilian physicist who had spent a career on the Arctic problem and who was aboard the Nautilus as the ice pilot, is not a household name. He never was. He kept working on under-ice submarine operations for decades afterward. Almost nobody outside the submarine force has ever heard of him. And Sergei Korolev, the chief designer, went on. He put Yuri Gagarin into space in 1961. He was still anonymous. He was still, in the eyes of his own government, a man who had once been an enemy of the people and had been useful enough to be forgiven. He died on January 14, 1966, on an operating table in Moscow, at 59, during surgery that went badly. There is a persistent account that the injuries the state had inflicted on his jaw decades earlier, in a cell in 1938, made it difficult for the surgeons to manage his airway. 2 days after he died, Pravda printed his name and his photograph. The world learned, for the first time, who had launched Sputnik. He was given a state funeral, and his ashes were placed in the Kremlin wall, and the man who had frightened the United States into building the modern age was finally allowed to have a name once he was safely unable to use it. So the beeping stopped, and the ice closed over the wake of the Nautilus, and the world moved on. Except that the ocean under the ice never stopped being contested, and it is not contested any less today. It is contested more. The United States Navy still runs submarines beneath the polar ice, regularly and deliberately, in a biennial exercise now called Operation Ice Camp, formerly ICEX. A temporary camp is built on the drifting ice, submarines come up through it, and crews practice exactly the things the Nautilus and the Skate proved were possible. In March 2026, the exercise ran again, with a fast attack submarine and hundreds of personnel on the ice. These are not commemorations, they are rehearsals. Russia has spent the last 15 years rebuilding the Arctic military infrastructure that collapsed with the Soviet Union. Bases that were abandoned in the 1990s have been reopened and modernized. On Franz Josef Land, at around 80 degrees north, there is a base called Nagorskoye, with a runway long enough to handle heavy aircraft, including strategic bombers. The strategic logic of that is not new, and it is not mysterious. It is the same logic the Skate demonstrated in 1959. The Russian Navy's ballistic missile submarines operate from the Kola Peninsula into the Barents and Kara Seas, and the ice and the geography are meant to shelter them, so that whatever happens elsewhere, that force survives and can answer. The ice is still armor. And there is a new machine. The Belgorod, handed over to the Russian Navy in 2022, is the largest submarine in service in the world today. She was built to carry the Poseidon, a nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed, autonomous torpedo, an enormous weapon designed to cross an ocean on its own and strike a coastline. Russia announced a successful test of its propulsion in October 2025. Western agencies have not independently confirmed it. And there is your uncomfortable echo, because that is precisely the position the United States was in during the missile gap, trying to work out whether a rival's terrifying announcement describes a real weapon or a very effective bluff. The map itself has changed too. Finland joined NATO in 2023. Sweden joined in 2024. Every Arctic nation except Russia is now in the alliance. And the ice that made the Arctic Ocean impassable is thinning. Summer sea ice is in long-term decline, and the Arctic is warming several times faster than the global average. The ocean that the Nautilus had to sneak under is slowly becoming an ocean that ships can sail across. The Nautilus herself is still afloat. She was decommissioned in 1980, and she sits today at Groton, a few miles from where her keel was laid, open to the public as a museum ship. You can walk aboard, you can stand in her control room, where the instruments still face the empty chairs. And if you do, it is worth thinking about what those men were actually sent to accomplish. They were not sent to sink anything. They were not sent to seize ground or destroy a weapon or gather intelligence. They were sent to be seen. Their government had lost an argument about who was more capable, and it dispatched 116 human beings under 1 million square miles of ice, with no possibility of rescue, in order to win that argument back. They did win it, and every one of them understood, at least dimly, that the risk they were taking was not to defend a border, but to change an impression. That is the strangest thing about the Cold War, and it is the thing that gets lost when we tell it as a story about hardware. The hardware was often beside the point. Sputnik was a radio transmitter in a shiny ball. The submarine that answered it was patched together with radiator sealant from a filling station. What passed between them was not force. It was meaning. And the men who supplied that meaning mostly did not get to keep it. Korolev got a name only after he stopped breathing. Wilkins reached his pole as a handful of ash. Waldo Lyon solved the navigation problem that made the whole thing possible and remains, to this day, a name you have to look up. The ice above them has thinned. The instruments have improved beyond anything Anderson could have imagined. The submarines beneath the Arctic tonight, American and Russian both, are quieter and deadlier than anything that existed in 1958. But they are still down there, in the dark, under the ice, doing the same thing the Nautilus did, staying hidden, being counted, making the other side wonder. That contest never ended. It just got quieter.